I'm curious to get your opinion on dopamine and ADHD. Dr. Andrew Huberman, I listen to him quite a bit. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he talks about there's this rise in ADHD, particularly young boys, but most kids because they're overstimulated. They're doing things that kind of rob them of dopamine or overstimulate them. The food, the video games, the social media, and so they're dopamine depleted. And in order to level themselves out, they need those Adderall, Ritalin, just to pay attention. And his theory is if you remove all these overstimulating things, the social media and the sugary foods, then the kid can now pay attention. Have you looked into these ideas? Like, what do you think about that philosophy?
Fraud.
Really?
That's the word that comes to mind. Whenever anybody is distilling down a complex behavior to a single neurotransmitter, you can stop listening.
All right, let's get into the science. How does a stimulant drug like Adderall help someone with ADHD? A lot of it has to do with the specific neurotransmitter in the brain that you've probably heard of before, dopamine. It's key when it comes to your brain's reward pathways. When you have a normal level of dopamine hanging out in the synapses of your brain, you're able to maintain motivation when you're doing something you're not thrilled about, like writing that paper. You're able to tolerate doing something you don't like now for a reward in the future. That warm, fuzzy feeling when you finish that paper and you never have to think about it again. But for someone with ADHD, there's less dopamine hanging out in the synapses. So there's less motivation to get through writing that paper.
Yo, did you measure dopamine in these kids? And then so you consistently see this depleted level. If people have a dopamine depletion, they won't be able to move. They would have Parkinson's disease. That's what Parkinson's disease is really about.
Genome-wide association studies, which use big data sets to look for patterns across the entire human genome, have found a relationship between genes involved in dopamine transmission and ADHD. Dopamine is commonly known as one of the reward molecules of the brain, but it's important for lots of other things too, like controlling decision-making, movement, and motivation.
Huh. Maybe I'm not articulating Andrew
I
Huberman's
think you
point.
are. If you talk about a dopamine depletion, that's kind of simple. There is no reason to be talking about dopamine and ADHD.
Do we know what causes ADHD?
It's genetic. People are not producing enough dopamine. So people have ADD aren't dumb, crazy, or stupid. Some of them are the brightest people I know, but their frontal lobes deactivate.
See, people look at people with ADHD and they'll talk about something called like hyperfocus. All hyperfocus is because ADHD brains are usually so starved for dopamine. If you find something that rewards you regularly, you will sit there and be fucking glued to it because now you have something that's like making you feel like okay for the first time because your brain doesn't ordinarily produce dopamine at the levels it should.
My frustration is when these frauds throw out terms like dopamine to lend credibility to their argument, which it doesn't when you really just ask a simple question. Hey, has anybody measured dopamine in these people? Just ask that simple question. This shit falls apart. Because no, why are you going to dopamine? Why didn't you talk about GABA? GABA is far more plentiful than dopamine. Why didn't you talk about glutamate? Glutamate is far more plentiful than dopamine. Why didn't you talk about the co-localization of dopamine with some peptide or something? So now you expose the fraud.
The other things that we see from an empirical scientific standpoint is we do know that there are certain areas of the brain and certain neurotransmitters implicated. For example, dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that is responsible for executive function, a reward system, focus and attention. We see when you sample the cerebrospinal fluid or the blood of people, the metabolites of dopamine is much lower than people that don't have ADHD. The activity of dopamine in those areas of the brain that I talked about, the prefrontal cortex, is lower when you look at functional imaging. It's lower in those areas of the brain in people that have ADHD.
people with ADHD have a really hard time relating to like reward that's not instantaneous, because there's actually like parts of the brain that are neurodevelopmentally delayed. Like if you autopsy like an ADHD person, there are certain parts in the forward part of the brain that are like, and it's anywhere from like 10 to 13% smaller than an ordinary person.
And one thing that we see that I found very interesting is that the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, have shown that it's 5% smaller in people that are exhibiting signs of ADHD. It's 5% more underdeveloped than people that do not have ADHD.
And what that means is for a neurodevelopmentally healthy brain, if you've got to read something for 4 hours, you can sit down and you can do it and you can read it because you know that you have to. For someone with ADHD, it is like an excruciatingly challenging task because unless you're being like constantly rewarded with some stream of stuff, to sit and actually focus on doing anything is like impossible.
That's lack of dopamine.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't have to be Andrew Huberman, but there are a number of doctors that, like I'm friends with Dr. Anna Lemke, who wrote Dopamine Nation.
Yep.
And I don't know if you've read that book, but it makes a great argument, and you're right, it does make you sound smart when you talk about dopamine. And according to these books, they do have ways of measuring dopamine, and they cite things
they
like
don't. That's a lie.
They don't.
It's an absolute lie. I mean, I know this better than anybody this part. This is what I do. You can't measure dopamine in the human brain. There's no direct measurement of dopamine in the human brain. You can't do that.
I had no idea.